In this mini lecture, I will be covering the topic of blood pressure and some of the factors that are involved in helping to maintain blood pressure. Um, so, first of all, blood pressure is generally measured in the arm, in the brachial artery. And when you're measuring blood pressure in an artery, there are two pressures. The first one is systolic pressure, and systole is when the ventricles are contracting. So, systolic pressure is the blood pressure in the artery as the ventricles contract, as they are in systole. That's why it's called systolic pressure. Then the other measurement is diastolic pressure. This is when the ventricles are in diastole. So it's blood pressure in the artery as the ventricles are relaxing. And if you take a look at this graph here on the PowerPoint, you can see in the aorta and in arteries, there is the top number, which is the systolic pressure. This is the higher number because there's greater pressure in the artery when the ventricles are actively contracting and squeezing blood out. The average systolic measurement is 120 millimeters of mercury. And then down here is the diastolic pressure. So this is when the ventricles are relaxed. And this is usually around 75 or 80. So this is lower because the ventricles are not actively contracting and squeezing blood out. They're relaxed at that moment. So in any artery, there are going to be two distinct blood pressure measurements. Blood pressure will be different depending on what's going on in the heart, whether the ventricles are contracting or relaxing. But you can see that as blood flows out of the arteries, through the arterioles, and then finally into capillaries, that first of all, blood pressure drops pretty dramatically. So it goes down to about 35. If you look at this graph here, when it first enters the capillaries, it's about 35, 37 millimeters of mercury. But now at this point, you can see there is just one measurement. There are not two here because at this point, blood is so far away from the heart that blood pressure remains steady and it doesn't change depending on the cardiac cycle. So whether the ventricles are contracting or whether they are relaxed, it doesn't make a difference. Blood pressure is going to be the same. It's going to be steady no matter what. So, the other thing is that it's important that blood pressure is pretty low once it enters the capillaries, because if you remember, capillaries only have one tunic. They have the tunica interna or tunica intima. That's just a single layer of endothelium. They don't have the outer thicker tunics. And so their walls are pretty fragile and they could potentially rupture if there's high blood pressure when blood enters the capillaries. So it's the fact that blood pressure is low is good because it's protecting the capillaries. And then blood pressure just continues to drop as it moves through the capillaries and then into the venous system. So once blood finally enters the veins, it's less than 20 millimeters of mercury, and it really just continues to drop. And by the time blood reaches the vena cava, blood pressure is nearly zero. So there's not a lot of force behind blood pushing it through the veins and getting it back to the heart. And that's why it's important that there are two, I refer to them as pumps in your study outline, but they're not actual pumps like the heart is. these are just two mechanisms that help maintain blood flow and blood pressure within the veins. And they help to ensure that blood does go in the right direction and it does get back to the heart where it should be going. So these two mechanisms are the respiratory pump and the muscular pump. So I'll start with the muscular pump. This refers to just skeletal muscles, which are located surrounding a lot of your veins. And this picture shows you an example of what this would look like. So here is a vein, and here are two muscles on either side of the vein. As these muscles contract, they squeeze the vein so that it is compressed and blood that was in this vein is forced up. And the blood goes up back into the heart where it should go. So basically, the more active you are and the more muscle movements you have, the better that helps with keeping blood flowing through your body and keeping that blood returning to the heart. And the other pump is called the respiratory pump. And this refers to pressure changes that occur in the abdominal and thoracic cavity as an individual breathes. So these pressures, and you don't need to know exactly what's happening. I'm not going to ask this in great detail, but as these pressures are changing, it is going to force blood up in the right direction. So blood is going to move up the body to get back to the heart where it's going. And one last thing that helps prevent blood from going in the wrong direction are the valves that are found in veins. Remember that only veins contain valves, arteries and capillaries do not. And these valves will close if blood starts to flow down in the wrong direction. A lot of veins are carrying blood up the body, so blood is moving against gravity. So gravity would have a tendency to pull blood back down. And these valves, if blood starts to flow back down, these valves are going to close and prevent blood from continuing to move all the way back down the body. If we didn't have these valves, and if we didn't have skeletal muscle movements and pressure changes related to respiration occurring to help keep blood moving in the right direction, then your blood would just sink all the way down and it would pool in your legs and in your feet. So these valves are preventing blood from doing that. Blood is going to catch in those valves. These valves are going to close and prevent the blood from traveling all the way back down to the bottom of your body, basically. Okay, and the other thing I want to talk about is some of the mechanisms that your body has to maintain blood pressure. So there are really three major factors that help to maintain and regulate blood pressure, and these are cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and blood volume. So whenever you have changes to any one of those things, it's going to directly impact blood pressure. So your body has some short-term mechanisms to regulate blood pressure and also long-term mechanisms. And when I refer to the terms short-term and long-term, it just means that if it's a short-term regulation, it's a very quick response that your body has. So if you want to increase blood pressure, if you use a short-term regulation, it would be a very quick increase in blood pressure. It would only take maybe a couple of minutes. But long-term regulation is over a longer period of time, so it might take a couple hours to go into effect. So the short-term regulation is usually done by it's controlled by the nervous system, And these are changes to cardiac output and changes to peripheral resistance that can help then influence blood pressure. So there are a couple types of receptors that are located in the body, specifically in major blood vessels and in the heart, that monitor blood pressure. So baroreceptors are pressure sensitive receptors. You have these in the aorta and the carotid arteries, for instance. So they are monitoring blood pressure constantly. And if blood pressure suddenly decreases, these baroreceptors are going to detect that, and they're going to initiate changes to peripheral resistance or heart rate or stroke volume in order to bring blood pressure back up to normal. So if, with the example I just gave, if you have a sudden decrease in blood pressure, then your body could increase stroke volume or heart rate in order to hopefully increase cardiac output, which would then increase blood pressure. There are also chemoreceptors, which are receptors that monitor chemical changes in the blood, especially they're monitoring oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And these are located in many of the same places that the baroreceptors are located, like major arteries. And they will also initiate changes in peripheral resistance, heart rate, and stroke volume in response to the chemical changes that they may detect in blood. So for example, if they detect a decrease in oxygen, they'll detect that, and they will make changes that would increase cardiac output to get more blood out to all areas of the body. Because if there's a decrease in oxygen, you can compensate by sending more blood, because blood is what carries oxygen. So sending more blood out to all of your body cells and tissues. So these are the short-term regulators when it's controlled by the nervous system. This is when blood pressure is being monitored by these two types of receptors, and there are changes made to heart rate, stroke volume. Those are the two factors that influence cardiac output, and also to peripheral resistance in order to make pretty immediate changes to blood pressure. Okay, the other controls are hormones. And certain hormones can have really can go into effect very quickly. So that would be a short-term response. Other hormones take a lot longer to have an effect. So that would be a long-term regulation. So the way that hormones regulate blood pressure is if they have an immediate response or a very quick response, they can do that by changing peripheral resistance. But if they are hormones that have a longer response time, that means that they are responding by making changes to blood volume. So any changes in blood volume take a while, and that's considered a long-term response. So a couple of these hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are often grouped together because they are sister hormones. They do the same thing. They're released from the adrenal gland. You have two adrenal glands located on top of each of your kidneys. And when these hormones are released, they increase heart rate and cardiac output, and they cause vasoconstriction, which affects peripheral resistance. So all of these things, by increasing heart rate, heart rate, cardiac output, causing vasoconstriction, all of that increases blood pressure. And it's a pretty immediate response. Another hormone called angiotensin II, it's released by the kidneys, and it also causes vasoconstriction throughout the body. So that increases peripheral resistance, which increases blood pressure. But there are two other hormones that have an effect on blood volume, And that takes a while to bring about these changes. So these are long-term regulators of blood pressure. So these two hormones are atrial natriuretic peptide, and that has the effect of decreasing blood volume. So whenever blood volume is decreased, blood pressure will decrease. And then the other hormone that has a long-term effect, so it takes a while, is antidiuretic hormone. And it does the opposite of atrial natriuretic peptide. It increases blood volume. So when it increases blood volume, that increases blood pressure. Okay, so just know that whenever there is an increase in blood volume, there's going to be an increase in blood pressure. It's a direct relationship. And then on the other hand, whenever there's a decrease in blood volume, there will be a decrease in blood pressure. All right, and that is it for blood pressure and mechanisms for regulating blood pressure.